a dragon, a goat, 7 horns, total destruction, rebirth, a new heaven, a new earth. Revelation has it all. Come join me as I take a walk through the book of Revelation and see what was on John's mind in the island of Patmos. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a wonderful, glorious day in the Lord's neighborhood, and welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Page. I am Page, your caffeine-imbued host, and here is my coffee. In the beginning, coffee. And lo, it was very good. Well, we're in chapter 14 of Revelation, and as it usually happens, I woke up this morning, and I haven't looked at chapter 14 yet, and I read through it, and I was at a loss. I just didn't know where I was going to go with this and what God was going to tell me through this. Revelation's been difficult for me in that regard because it isn't a straight-up teaching epistle like any one of Paul's letters or Peter's letters or even John's letters. It's telling a story, and I have to find a way to apply that story to my life. And that's the challenge of Revelation. But as God always does, by the end of my time studying this morning, I had a pretty good idea where I was going with this, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So let's take a look at Revelation 14, verses 1 through 5. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven, like the roar of rushing waters, and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. See, the number 144,000 in the book of Revelation, specifically in this passage and in Revelation 7, has been interpreted in a couple different ways, depending on theological tradition and hermeneutical approach. And we're going to take a look at those 2 interpretations. First of all, the question is, who are they? Who are these 144,000 people? Well, here it says they're sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel. In chapter 7, anyway, it says that. In Revelation 14, here, they're described as standing with the Lamb in Mount Zion, having his Father's names written on their foreheads. They're pure, blameless, and sing a new song no one else can learn. Now, according to Revelation 7, verse 9, they are a group within a group. In other words, there is a great multitude that no one can count. That's what Revelation 7:9 says. There's a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language. So there must be very something. Is that bad grammar? I believe it is. There must be something very special about these 144,000 to make them stand out from this great multitude. I believe the great multitude of chapter 7 are those that are described as generating that sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters, like a loud peal of thunder that we read about here in chapter 14. Who are these worshipers? Who are these 144,000? As usual, there are basically 2 interpretive views, literal and figurative. Let's look at the literal view first. As you know, John, as he gazed into this vision in Revelation, he saw a moment that has sparked centuries of debate. The sealing of 144,000 individuals from the tribes of Israel. According to Revelation 7, this group consisted of 12,000 from each tribe, each of the 12 tribes, Judah, Reuben, Gad, etc. Angels sealed them before the coming judgments of the Great Tribulation, a time of distress unlike any other. Later, in Revelation 14, John sees them again standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion, pure, blameless, singing a new song that only they can sing. They were described as those who had not defiled themselves, who followed the Lamb wherever he went, first fruits to God and to the Lamb. See, it was passages like these that laid the foundation up for a very particular view, one that has been widely embraced within premillennialism circles, a framework of end times theology that emerged in the 19th century, or I should say reemerged, and gained traction through popular teachers and writers in the 20th and 21st centuries. According to this view, the 144,000 are literal Jews, ethnic descendants of Abraham, who came to faith during the Great Tribulation after the church has been raptured and taken out of the world. Now, Paul seems to hint at something like this when he writes in Romans 11, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening, in part, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it's written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. In this understanding, the church and Israel are two very distinct entities in God's redemptive plan. Israel is being hardened so that the full number of the Gentiles can come in, two groups of people. The church's role, many believe, ends with the rapture. Is this what Paul is hinting at in Romans when he says in verse 25, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and then Israel will be reintroduced to God's redemptive plan? That's kind of what Paul's hinting at. Then begins, in the premillennialist point of view, then begins 7 years of judgment and turmoil. Many refer to this as the Great Tribulation. And during this time, God resumes his covenantal dealings with Israel. He set it aside to deal with the church in their point of view. Now he goes back to them, and in this framework, they are sealed for protection and commissioned as evangelists. They're not just preserved, they are sent. Many dispensationalists, like John Walvoord, Tim LaHaye, David Jeremiah, they teach that this group spreads the gospel during the darkest days of earth, leading multitudes to salvation. Now, what makes this view persuasive to many is a literal reading of the text. The number is precise. It's 144,000. The tribes are named. The individuals are described as male virgins, morally upright, zealous for the Lamb. These features, to a dispensationalist, point away from a symbolic interpretation and toward a very specific, identifiable group of people, faithful Jews who are sealed and protected by God. This interpretation continues to shape much of popular Christian thought, especially through books like Left Behind or sermons and prophecy conferences. It's a view rooted not just in Revelation's words, but in a broader theological story, one that sees God's promises to Israel as enduring, literal, and waiting to be fulfilled in the final chapter of human history. Now, in the 2nd century, Christian theology was still in its infancy, and interpretations of Revelation, including the identity of the 144,000 in chapters 7 and 14, were not yet fully systematized. However, we do have some insight from early church fathers like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Papias, who reflect early Christian thought on eschatology and Israel. Their views are important, as these men, especially Irenaeus, were at most one generation removed from John the Apostle. To my mind, this gives them serious weight in their thoughts and opinions, as perhaps reflecting the thoughts and opinions of Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of John the Apostle, and even John himself. In the 2nd century, the church was young, often persecuted, still deeply apocalyptic in its worldview. In other words, They lived their Christian life within the framework of thinking that they were indeed living in the last literal days. The book of Revelation, written near the end of the first century, had not yet been carefully systematized by formal theology, but it was widely respected and taken seriously by early Christian thinkers. Now, among those thinkers was Irenaeus of Lyons, a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn had been a disciple of the Apostle John. In his monumental work against heresies, Irenaeus treated the book of Revelation as literal prophecy, especially in its future-looking millennial passages. He affirmed a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. He believed that the faithful would rise from the dead and reign with Christ during this millennium. When it came to the 144,000, Irenaeus, while not giving a detailed breakdown on the tribes, took many of Revelation's numbers and figures at face value. He seemed to assume they represented real future events, real future people. So for Irenaeus and others with similar views, the 144,000 were likely understood as literal, either faithful Jews or a select group of the faithful preserved by God in the last days. Justin Martyr, another influential second century theologian and apologist, he also maintained a belief in a literal millennium and God's ongoing plan for ethnic Israel, even while insisting that the church is the true spiritual Israel. He didn't comment directly on the 144,000, but his writings suggest that he would have been open to a mixed or perhaps a dual interpretation, ethnic Jews who believe in Christ as part of the church, participating in end-time fulfillment. Papias, though only fragments of his writings exist, was also associated with a literal millennial expectation. We don't have a record of him interpreting the 144,000 specifically, but his overall eschatology aligns with those who might have taken those numbers as literal and future-oriented. Now, at the same time, there were also symbolic elements emerging. While no detailed allegorical reading of the 144,000 appears in the second century, early Christians were already beginning to understand the church as spiritual Israel, especially in their discussions about the continuity between the Old and New Covenants. So while the early church fathers in the second century didn't give us a systematic commentary in the 144,000, their literalist and millennial leanings suggest they likely saw these as real people, perhaps Jewish believers, who played a significant and will play a significant role in the end-time scenario, which is still to come. Now, let's go to the other side of the fence, the amillennial view. The amillennial interpretation of the 144,000 in Revelation 7 and 14 sees them not as literal Jews, but as a symbolic representation of the complete and redeemed people of God, the church, composed of both Jews and Gentile believers. Now, in Revelation 7, this view says, before the winds of judgment are released on the earth, John hears a number, 144,000, sealed from the tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. To the literalist, we know this seems straightforward. But in the amillennial framework, things aren't always as they first appear. This is not simply a roll call of ethnic Israelites. Rather, the amillennialists understand that these 12 tribes are symbolic of the entire covenant people of God. The number itself, 144,000, is symbolic, mathematical. 12, the number of tribes, times 12, the number of apostles of the church, times 1,000, symbolic of completeness or a vast multitude. It's a measure of fullness, not a census of ethnic Jews. For amillennial interpreters, this vision is not about future ethnic Israel, but about the spiritual Israel, the whole body of believers sealed by God for protection, not from suffering or martyrdom, but from spiritual harm. Just as God sealed his people in Ezekiel 9 to spare them from divine judgment, here, the 144,000, according to the amillennialists, represent the church in its totality, marked as God's own during times of tribulation, protected by his grace, even in persecution. Then in Revelation 14, John sees them again, this time standing triumphantly with the Lamb on Mount Zion. They are described as pure, faithful, following the Lamb wherever he goes. To the amillennial reader, this is not a different group, but the same 144,000 now portrayed in their heavenly reward. Their purity and devotion are signs of their faithfulness in the face of spiritual battle, not literal virginity or ethnic lineage. More importantly, amillennialists see these visions as timeless symbols rather than chronological events. The sealing in Revelation 7 symbolizes the church's spiritual security in our present age. The scene in Revelation 14 depicts the same group, now glorified, on the other side of death's wall. In this way, the 144,000 are understood to represent God's people from every age, every nation, and every tribe, preserved through tribulation and brought safely into his presence. So, amillennialism, unlike premillennialism, sees no sharp division between Israel and the church. Instead, it sees the church as a continuation and fulfillment of Israel, grafted into the one people of God through Christ. For them, the 144,000 are not a literal Jewish remnant to rise in a future great tribulation, but they are the symbolic people of God in this present age, held fast by his seal and destined to reign with Christ forever. Now let's take a look at where the shift started to move from the premillennial to the amillennial side of the house. The symbolic interpretation of the 144,000 in Revelation began to take shape in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Christian theology is maturing, and it's shifting from a primarily literal millennial framework to a more allegorical and spiritualized reading of Scripture, especially prophetic and apocalyptic texts. Here's how and when that shift occurred. With the rise of scholars like Origen of Alexandria, biblical interpretation began to take a sharp turn toward the allegorical method. And I can see why. The prophecies of Revelation didn't seem to have immediate fulfillment. So, therefore, the literal view has to be wrong. So they come up with another view, the allegorical view. Origen didn't interpret Revelation literally. He applied spiritual meanings to numbers, images, and prophetic events. And though he doesn't focus extensively on the 144,000 specifically, his style of interpretation influenced many who saw numbers in Revelation as symbolic, not mathematical. Origen paved the way for viewing the 144,000 as symbolic of the whole church, not a literal Jewish remnant. Then there's Augustine of Hippo. In his book, The City of God, Augustine rejected a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ and interpreted Revelation spiritually, marking the formal rise of amillennialism. Although Augustine didn't spend much time on the 144,000 specifically, his method influenced later interpreters to read it as symbolic, representing the entire body of the redeemed, not just the Jews. He understands that the tribes of Israel in Revelation 7, that is symbolic of spiritual Israel, i.e. the church. He viewed the number 144,000 as a symbol of completeness and perfection, representing the full number of the elect. So thank you, Augustine. Now, through the Middle Ages into the Reformation, most scholars followed Augustinian eschatology, meaning the 144,000 is figuratively the church militant on earth, or the church triumphant in heaven. Even reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther, though he was hesitant about Revelation as a whole, they leaned towards symbolic interpretations in keeping with amillennial readings. So the symbolic interpretation of the 144,000 began to emerge 2 or 3 centuries after Revelation was written. It began to be fully developed and systematized by the 4th and 5th centuries, especially through Augustine's influence. And from that point forward, symbolic and spiritual readings became the majority view of Christian theology until literal interpretation began to arrive in the 19th century. So here's my dilemma. Can you see it? If I listen primarily to the men who were closest to the original author, i.e., closest to John, then I fall on the side of premillennialism. If I listen primarily to those theologians who perhaps had more access to what we would call the completed canon, i.e., the writings of all the apostles, then I would fall on the side of amillennialism. Both arguments have merit. It makes me wonder, does Occam's razor apply here? Occam's razor is a philosophical principle that suggests the simplest explanation is usually the best one. More precisely, it states that when faced with a competing hypothesis or a competing explanation, the one with the fewest assumptions should be preferred, unless more complexity is required by the evidence. If that's the case, then the premillennial view wins out. It takes the passage and passages like it at face value. But then I have to stop and ask, do I really want to fuss with Augustine, one of the greatest theological minds in the history of the church? Let's not forget the big picture, though. Revelation is a story of the church triumphant, gaining victory over persecution and tribulation, literal or figurative. So wherever you stand on this issue of amillennial versus premillennial, the end should be the same. We win. For now, that's the hill I'm planting my flag on. Now, the jury is still out which side of that hill I'm going to be standing on. See, in one respect, the premill versus amill debate is truly, in my mind, trivial compared to the real question. Let's pretend the premill view is correct. The church has been raptured. 144,000 Israelites scattered around the globe evangelizing during the Great Tribulation. Where are you? Are you part of that great multitude standing and worshiping before the throne of God? Have you made it past the judgment seat of God to be a part of that great multitude? Have you remained faithful to God in the face of a world that is your mortal enemy? See, there is a warning inherent in Revelation. And that warning is simple: as time winds down and all of human history comes to a close. Are you in the Lamb's Book of Life? Now let's pretend for a moment that amillennialism is correct. This revelation is all symbolic. The issues are still the same. There is a church at war with the world. The enemy of our souls seeks our destruction. We make it past the judgment seat of God to live in an eternity of bliss in His presence. Have you remained faithful to God in the face of a world that is your mortal enemy? No matter your stance, the important questions do not change. Are you pursuing God? Are you pursuing holiness? When I started out with this study, I will confess, I was pretty much a strong premillennialist. But I determined to understand the amillennial point of view. My goal was, and is, to be able to present both sides of this discussion equally well. As a result, I am discovering there is a great deal of value in both views. So where does that leave me? Still pondering. That's a good place to stop. I'm Paige. Here's my coffee. It's still good. Have a great and glorious day. Bye-bye. Don't forget to join me at www.patreon.com/coffeebiblepage or my website, www.coffeebiblepage.com. Have a glorious and blessed day. Bye-bye.